Chapter 1. The Bolted Map. The rope bridge to the shaft head swayed under 11 days of rations, and I counted the sway like I counted everything. 3 steps, hold. 3 steps, hold. Don't look at the black chasm the engineers had left where the west switchback used to be. Bellow Deep had eaten one crew's supply trail 11 years back, and the guild had never bothered rebuilding it properly, because Bellow Deep didn't pay well enough anymore to justify the lumber. It would pay today. 400 crowns a floor, certified dormant, signed by a guild notary who hadn't bothered to look up from his ledger when I signed beneath him. 7 floors on the old schedule, 2,800 crowns, if the core had stayed as dead as its file said. Teodri's letter was creased soft from writing in my coat pocket since the last way station. Don't sell it for me, he'd written, ignoring the plain arithmetic of his own debt. I can still work off half of it myself if you'd let me. He couldn't. Not from where the debt holders had him. Not in the time either of us had left. I was carrying his letter down a shaft anyway, because some stubbornness is worth keeping, even when neither of us could afford it. The winch platform waited at the top of the shaft, a disc of iron chained to a drum thick as a barrel, and the operator barely glanced at me as he logged my name against the manifest. Orem. Surveyor's contract. Bellow Deep. Day 1 of an open-ended term. He said it like he was reading a grocery list. You want the safety line doubled? No. Doubled line meant a slower descent, and slow descent meant more of my 11 days burned on the way down instead of the way through. My boots touched the platform, and the mark woke up as it always did, without ceremony, without so much as a flicker of warning. The iron under my feet resolved into clean blue lines behind my eyes, a floor plan sketching itself into being. Platform, chain housing, the 2 support struts bolted through bedrock. Every edge sharp, every measurement true down to the inch, because the mark didn't guess.
Surveyor's mark, winch platform, logged. No hazards detected.
11 years of contracts, and it still did the same thing every time. My shoulders came down half an inch I hadn't known were up. I let it pass. Ease didn't pay indentures. I had 10 minutes before the operator would start the drum, and I let my feet carry me toward the crew roster bolted to the shaft head post anyway, the same as I did before every descent. Every dungeon site kept one, a brass plate listing every certified expedition that had gone down and come back, or gone down and not, a courtesy to the families, mostly, and a warning to anyone fool enough to read it closely. Bellow Deep's plate was green with age, the bolts rusted to a color like dried blood, and the most recent line on it wasn't recent at all. 11 years old. The last expedition anyone had logged before the core went quiet and the guild stopped sending crews down at all. Expedition of record. Bellow Deep, floors 1 through 7. Captain I. Reyd. Surveyor V. Orem. Registry 4471. I read it twice because the first time my eyes simply refused to hold the shape of it. My own name, my own registry number, the one stamped into every ledger I'd filed since I was 19 years old and freshly certified, sitting on a roster for an expedition I could not make myself remember standing on. Something in the shape of the captain's name pulled at me the way a scar pulls before rain, and I would not let myself go looking for why. My hand found the strut rail before I told it to, and the wind off the shaft had nothing to do with why I held on. I made myself breathe, deliberately, one lungful at a time, and looked for the ordinary explanation first, because the ordinary explanation is usually the true one. A clerical error. A dead Orem, some cousin of a cousin, whose registry got copied wrong onto a plate nobody had proofread in a decade. It happened. Guild clerks were tired men doing tedious work, and tedious work bred mistakes. I wanted it to be a forgery. I wanted, badly enough that my hand was already moving before I'd finished deciding to move it, to prove some fool had scratched my name into that brass after the fact. A joke, a grudge, anything with a human hand behind it that I could be angry at instead of afraid of. I dug my belt knife under the edge of the letters and scraped. Forged plating flakes. Fresh ink sits on top of old metal like a scab, and a scab lifts. I'd expected green shavings and a clean line of newer brass underneath. Proof some idiot had etched this in the last year to spook a superstitious surveyor out of an easy bounty. What came up under my blade was rust. Rust. And beneath the rust, ink that had bled into the metal's grain over decades of damp and frost and thaw, layer on layer, indistinguishable now from the corrosion around it. The letters of my own name were part of the brass now, corroded into it at the same rate as everything else on it. Older than the plate's own rot had any right to let something be. Behind me, the winch operator called down that the drum was ready whenever I was. I didn't answer him. I stood at the shaft head with my knife still in my hand, and 11 days of rations on my back, and a name that had been waiting on that post for 11 years, for a version of me that hadn't been born yet to come and read it. Chapter 2. What the Bounty Buys. The operator called down again, "Drums ready whenever you are," and this time I turned from the plate and answered him.
Give me the hour,
I said.
I want to write something before I go down.
He didn't ask what. Winchmen on the Bellow Deep contract learned early not to ask what. I climbed the ladder off the platform with my knife still open in my hand, folded it shut only once I was inside the shaft head hut, and sat at the plank table with a lamp and a fresh sheet of gilled paper, because if I thought about the plate for one more minute, I was going to walk back down that ladder and never descend at all. So I wrote the numbers instead. Numbers didn't have a plate to weigh against, or an 11-year-old expedition roster with my registry stamped into it in someone else's hand. Teodri. 7 floors, 400 crowns each, certified dormant and reported clean. That's 2,800, and the buyout on your paper is 26. I checked the figure twice against the copy you sent. So unless the guilds change the terms again without telling either of us, this pays it, and leaves us something over for the coach fare home. I know you never wanted to ask me for it. I know the debt only exists because the guild ruled my last descent unrecorded, which meant no pensions attached, which meant the estate they billed you for wasn't mine to owe and became yours to owe instead, because somebody has to owe something, and the guild had already decided it wasn't going to be them. I'm not writing that to make you feel the weight of it. I'm writing it so you understand why I took this contract instead of a safer one. There isn't a safer one that pays 2,800 crowns for work that's already 11 years overdue. Bellow Deep's core hasn't logged a spawn event in over a decade. That's the whole job. Walk it, log it, stamp it, come home. I'll write again from the third landing. V. I read it back once, folded it into the oilcloth pouch the courier bat would carry up with the next supply run, and did not let myself think too long about how much of that letter was true, and how much of it was the shape a lie takes when you need it to hold weight for a few more days. Floor 1 took 90 minutes, and 90 minutes was long enough to make me want an apology from the guild for how easy they were. My mark drew the entry hall the moment my boots crossed the threshold. Walls and doorways resolving into clean blue lines. No flicker, no error. Nothing like the plate at all. Dust lay undisturbed in drifts along the baseboards, thick enough that my footprints were the only marks in it. Bones in the second chamber, dry as kindling, arranged the way bones settle when nothing has moved them in a long time. The walls held no blood, no claw marks, no scorch. A dungeon reads dormant when its core hasn't produced a spawn event in 10 straight years, and floor 1 wore that stillness like a coat it had owned a long while. I logged every room the regulation called for, walked the full perimeter twice to be sure the mark hadn't missed a door behind a fall of rubble, and stamped the seal into my ledger with my own hand steady on the page. Floor 1, dormant. 400 crowns. And the ink hadn't even dried before my shoulders came down out of somewhere near my ears. A tightness I hadn't let myself call fear, unclenching all at once, the weight of it simply gone. I let myself grin at the dust settling behind me. 11 days of rations, and if the rest of the deep went this quiet, I'd be back at the surface with 6 days to spare, and a signature from the guild inspector that meant Teodri never had to sign another paper as long as he lived. I was 3 steps past the stairwell down, still turning that thought over, when my mark logged a room I hadn't walked into. A false read flickers at the edge of sight before it corrects. An unstable mark throwing up a wall that isn't there, and then taking it back. This one didn't flicker. It arrived whole. Blue lines settling into place with the same patient certainty as the entry hall behind me. A chamber 3 doors down the corridor I hadn't yet reached. Dimensions squared off. A bench along the east wall. A cracked floor tile near the door drawn in with the same careful hatching I used when a hazard needed flagging. And in the corner of that drawn room, small and neat, was a label in my own hand. I stood in the corridor with the ledger still open on floor 1's fresh seal. A room I had never set foot in laid out complete on the page in front of me. Already surveyed. Already mine. Chapter 3. 3 Tokens. The chamber 3 doors down looked exactly like the drawing said it would, and that was worse than if it hadn't.
Prove it wrong,
I said to the empty corridor, and my voice came back off the stone smaller than I'd sent it out. I counted the doors as I went. 1, 2, 3, checking each number against the last, twice, before I trusted it. The 3rd door stood ajar an inch, same as the drawing showed it. Hinges rusted to the same brown-black the ink had rendered them in. I put my palm flat against the wood and pushed. It swung without a sound, which a door that old had no business doing, and the room on the other side matched the blue lines in my ledger the way a corpse matches its own death mask. Bench along the east wall. 6 feet of stone, waist height, the grain of it worn smooth in one spot the size of a seated body. A crack in the floor tile by the threshold. Hairline, running north-south, exactly where the drawing had hatched it, in the careful crosshatch I use for hazards that won't kill you, but will turn an ankle if you're not watching your feet. I crouched and put 2 fingers against the crack. Real. Cold the way stone is cold. Gritty with 11 years of dust nobody had disturbed to leave a print in. I had never stood in this room. I would have remembered the bench, the particular slant of light coming down through a ceiling grate that didn't appear on any structural drawing I'd been issued. And yet my hand, when I checked the ledger page against the wall in front of me, had already labeled the ceiling grate, in my own script. In brown ink gone the color of the crack in the floor. There's a discipline built for exactly this kind of moment, drilled into me until it lived in my hands instead of my head, and I reached for it now with a knot tester's blunt confidence. Pull first, doubt later. You don't argue with a room. You log it. I opened to a clean page, ignored the ghost draft entirely. I didn't cross it out, didn't annotate it, just turned past it like it was another surveyor's abandoned notebook I'd found on the floor. Then I walked the room's perimeter with my palm brushing the wall, letting the mark resolve it fresh under my own boots, my own eyes, my own hand moving the pen. Bench, east wall, 6 feet, crack, north-south, hazard hatched. Grate, ceiling, 4 feet by 4, structural origin unknown, flag for report. I signed it Orem, registry 4471, and dated it. And only once the ink had dried did I turn back to the ghost page beside it. Same room, same bench. My great flag hadn't existed on the first draft. I'd added a detail the ghost hadn't bothered with, and I stood there with my thumb against the wet edge of the ink, turning that small mismatch over, trying to decide which was worse, a page that matched me exactly, or one that didn't. Whatever had drawn this room first, it wasn't better at this than I was. It was only faster. That didn't make it slower now. I didn't sleep on that thought. I couldn't afford to. I had a floor to close. Day 2. 10 days of rations left in the pack. I'd taken to counting both each morning. One number before all the others. Teodri had pressed the last of the dried meat into my hand at the shaft head. Don't come back light, he'd said, meaning something else entirely. I hadn't answered him then. I was answering him now, one room at a time. The stair down to the first landing was iron switchback bolted into the shaft wall, and it announced every step I took on it with a groan that traveled up through my boots and into my teeth. Landings on a guild descent aren't decoration. They're checkpoints, cut into the standard for exactly one purpose: to give the winch something to answer to besides your say-so. At the bottom of the first run, my mark caught the landing plate the moment my boot crossed onto it. A foot of worked stone, a socket at its center the size of a fist, a token sitting inside it like a held breath. I'd been told about this in training, years back, in a room with better lighting, and none of this cold. I'd never used one for real. I set my palm over the socket, and it took the warmth off my skin like it had been waiting for exactly that.
Ascent warrant. One of 3 landings stamped.
1.
I said, and kept talking, out loud. You pull on a rope to check it. You don't just trust the knot with your eyes.
3 landings. 3 tokens. 1 ride up.
It sounded stupid in the empty stairwell. It sounded like exactly what it was. A woman alone 11 years past the last living crew this shaft had held. Talking to iron so the iron would know she meant to leave. I said it again anyway on the way down to the landing floor proper, quieter, until it stopped being a prayer and went back to being arithmetic. 3 tokens bought 1 trip up the winch line. I had one. 2 floors and 2 landings stood between me and the other 2, and every hour I spent logging rooms was an hour closer to having them. I did the ledger work that night by lamp, sitting on an overturned crate at the floor 2 threshold with my knees for a desk, sorting the day's pages into the order the guild wants them filed. Dormant seal first, room surveys behind it, warrant stamp logged last. Floor 1, sealed. The ghost room, mine now, corrected and signed. The landing token, noted with its little stamped glyph. I flipped to slot floor 2's fresh pages in behind them, and my thumb caught on paper that hadn't been there that morning. A single sheet, bound into the spine between floor 6's blank allotment and the back cover, certification weight stock, the guild's watermark pressed faint into the corner, same as it presses into every official page I've ever filed. Blank. No survey lines penciled in as guides. No floor number printed at the header, though every other certification page in this ledger carries one, because I requisitioned this ledger myself, 6 days ago, from the clerk on shift, and I counted the pages again, careful, twice over. I turned back to the front matter and counted again, finger moving down the spine, floor by floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I don't own a floor 7. My contract runs 7 floors, and my ledger was bound for 6, because the shaft map I'd studied before I ever climbed the winch platform showed 6 floors surveyed and a 7th rendered as nothing at all. An empty rectangle with no doors drawn into it, no dimensions, no name in the corner. Nobody had certified a page for a floor that, by every record I'd been given, didn't have walls yet. Somebody had bound one into my ledger anyway. Chapter 4. The Blank Rectangle. I didn't sleep on it. I got up instead, lit the lamp low so it wouldn't wake the wick faster than it had to, and went back through my kit until I found the copy of the guild's floor schedule. The official one, the one filed with the contract, not the shaft head plate I'd already scraped at once and didn't want to touch again. If somebody was going to tell me a floor existed before I'd walked it, I wanted to see their paperwork. The schedule matched the bolted map at the shaft head almost line for line, which told me at least one forger, if there was a forger, had been consistent. Floors 1 through 6 were rendered in ink, gone, the particular brown-black of 11 years oxidation, each with its rooms squared off, its exits marked. A surveyor's initials pressed into the corner of every page like a thumbprint. I.R. Ilma Reyd, Captain and Surveyor of Record, 6 times over. Competent hand. Steady lines. In the margin beside floor 6's last room, in that same hand, 2 words she'd apparently thought worth writing down, and nothing more. Capacity. Not dormancy. No gloss under it. No arrow pointing at what it modified. I read it twice, filed it with the rest of what I didn't have an answer for, and turned to floor 7. Floor 7 was a rectangle. Just that. 4 straight edges and nothing inside them. No doors, no corridor stubs breaking the border where a room would need to connect to the level above it. No dimensions noted along the sides, which every surveyor, including me, was drilled to note before she'd so much as cleared her throat to call a room done. No initials. Somebody had drawn 6 certified floors and then stopped drawing, 11 years ago, at the exact edge of a floor nobody had ever walked. And my ledger, 6 days old, requisitioned for 6 floors, had a page bound into it for a 7th floor that, by this schedule, didn't have walls yet. I sat with the lamp burning down and worked it like arithmetic. Numbers, not omens. Because if I let it turn into anything else, I'd be awake until the wick gave out. 2 possibilities. Either the blank page was a printer's error, a stray sheet from some other surveyor's ledger, bound in wrong at the guild office, which happened, which was boring, which I wanted to be true, or somebody already knew floor 7 existed and hadn't told me, hadn't told Reyd, hadn't told the 6 certified floors above it what was underneath them. I didn't have the tools to answer that at a writing desk. I had them on the floors themselves. So I closed the ledger, banked the lamp, and told myself the 7th floor was tomorrow's problem, because I still had a floor 2 to log, and floor 2 paid the same 400 crowns whether or not I'd spent the night staring at a blank rectangle instead of sleeping. Day 3, and it already had teeth. The stairwell down to floor 2 was cut clean through bedrock, wide enough for 2 men and a stretcher, and my mark took it in the way it took in everything. Walls resolving into blue lines the instant my boots crossed the threshold. A floor plan stitching itself together room by room ahead of my lamp. Ordinary work. I'd done 400 crowns worth of it already, and floor 2 looked, at first, like more of the same. Dust undisturbed in 11 years. A stretcher rack gone to rust. A boot print fossilized in dried mud that nobody had walked through since. Then the mark tagged a room.
Floor 2, Room 4, occupied.
I stopped in the corridor and read it twice. Occupied meant a living thing. That was the only reading I'd ever been trained to give it. A spawn. An animal that had wandered down from the surface and gotten lost. Something with a heartbeat. Bellow Deep had gone quiet 11 years ago, and stayed quiet long enough that the guild certified its core dormant on the strength of a decade, with no spawn event logged anywhere in it. A dead dungeon didn't have occupied rooms. I'd surveyed floor 1 with nothing flagging, and no reason to expect different here. I told myself it was the same glitch as the ghost chamber, the mark running ahead of itself, guessing wrong, and I'd walk in and find an empty room and correct the record the way I'd corrected the last one. That was the disciplined Reyd. I held on to it and kept walking. The door had swollen shut in its frame, and I put a shoulder to it, the way I'd put a shoulder to 100 stuck doors on 100 dead floors. I didn't stop to think about it further. Thinking about it further was how the night had already cost me an hour of sleep. So I just leaned in, and it gave all at once, and I went in half a step faster than I meant to. A man was sitting against the far wall, guild leathers laced to the throat, a surveyor's kit belt still buckled at his hip, with a date stamped into the leather that put it 11 years old to the season. His chest moved, slow and even, lamplight catching the wet shine of it, rising and falling. A man asleep, or resting, or simply waiting, in a room that had been sealed and silent and certified empty for 11 years, in a dungeon that hadn't spawned so much as a rat in a decade. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I stood in the doorway with my hand still flat against the wood, a dead man's kit rising and falling with somebody's living breath, and I could not for the length of 3 full breaths of my own decide which of us the room was more wrong about. Chapter 5. Retention.
Guild business.
I said, the same words I'd used on every locked door and startled scavenger in 11 years of survey work, and the man in the 11-year-old leathers went on breathing, like I hadn't spoken at all. I lifted the lamp. Nothing in his face tracked the light, no pupils contracting, no flicker toward the doorway where I stood haloed in it. His chest kept its slow, patient rhythm, in, out, a man asleep in a chair that had rotted around him. I crossed the threshold. My boots found dust that hadn't been disturbed by anything but rat traffic in a decade, and the floor plan resolved blue and clean around me the way it always did. Walls and one door and a body that the mark, a beat late, tagged the way it tagged everything else in the room.
Room 24. Guild Surveyor, Registry 3390. P. Dassel. Status. Retained.
I read it twice. Retained wasn't a status the guild manual carried, not for a person, and my hand had already gone to the ledger at my hip before the rest of me had decided what to do with the word.
Dassel.
I said, because a registry number wanted a name attached to it, because that was how you logged a body, and because some part of me still expected him to open his eyes at the sound of his own. He didn't. What he did was flinch. Small, at first, a tightening around the mouth like he'd bitten down on something, and then his right hand came up off his knee and pressed flat against his own side, low, under the ribs, and when he drew it back the leather there was dark and getting darker. There had been no wound on him a minute ago. I was sure of that, the way I was sure of the shaft depth or the count of my own fingers, and I stood very still while a man who had been sitting quietly against the wall began, in real time, in front of me, to bleed.
Hold still.
I said, stupidly, already moving toward him, already reaching for a field dressing I didn't have, because there was no wound, 11 years old, and open. No wound at all, except the one performing itself across his ribs on some schedule I hadn't been given, and he said something under his breath that wasn't for me. Tell Fesk, he said, and I stopped with my hand still out. Tell Fesk, the 7th floor is not empty. He said it again 40 seconds later, thinner, the words starting to slur at the edges the way a man's voice slurs, when the blood leaving him is taking the strength for consonance with it. He tried to stand. His leg gave and he went down sideways against the wall he'd been resting on, and the stain had spread past his belt by then, black in the lamplight, and he said it a third time, barely more than a shape his mouth made. Tell Fesk. And then his eyes were open and fixed on nothing, and his chest had stopped moving at all. I did not go to him. I want to say I weighed it and decided against it, that there was a clean reason I stood in the doorway with my lamp arm shaking and my other hand locked on the ledger strap. But the truth is simpler than that. Some animal part of me had already understood what my mark status line was telling me, and it kept my feet where they were. 4 seconds of stillness. Then his chest rose again, slow and even, and his hand came off his side and settled back onto his knee, and the stain on his leathers was gone, like it had never been there, and he sat against the wall, breathing exactly the way he had been breathing when I first opened the door. I counted it out loud, the way I counted landings, because a number was a thing I could hold on to. 4 minutes, near enough, from the first flinch to the last stopped breath, and then the reset, and then the 4 minutes again. I checked my ledger's clock against it twice to be sure I wasn't imagining the seam. I wasn't. He bled out, said his sentence 3 times on a schedule that never varied by more than a few seconds, died, and began again, and somewhere in that loop was the whole of what had happened to him on this floor, 11 years ago, playing itself out for no audience at all until I'd walked in and become one. The deep didn't spawn. I understood that now, though the understanding had come too late to be any use to Dassel. The stat block told me nothing but a name and a word. What taught me was a dead man performing his own death a second time, while I stood close enough to smell blood that had dried a decade ago and was somehow, impossibly, wet. It kept. Whatever the core down here was, it didn't make monsters out of nothing. It took what died in it, and it filed the dying away as a working record, and it ran that record on a loop the way my mark ran a logged room, stable, exactly the same each time you walked back in. Which meant the manual said the wrong thing when it said Dassel could only repeat what he'd done in life. I wanted to test that before I let myself believe it, and the only test I had was the one thing his record couldn't have anticipated, because nobody 11 years ago had known to give it to him.
Petrin Dassel.
I said, full name, registry cadence, precise as a roster entry. His head came up. Not toward me, toward nothing, toward wherever his eyes had been fixed at the start of the loop, and his chest hitched and dropped, and the whole 4 minutes folded back to its opening beat. A man sitting quiet against a wall, with a wound that hadn't happened to him yet. I'd done that. I'd said 6 syllables and sent him back to the beginning to bleed out again, and there was no way to give him back the 4 minutes I'd just cost him for the sake of my own curiosity. I backed out of the room slowly, eyes on it the whole time, and I didn't stop moving until the door was between us, and the corridor's blue lines had closed clean around me. My hands weren't steady. I made them steady, the way I'd steadied them over a stat sheet 100 times before, and I opened the ledger to a fresh page, dated it day 3, 9 days of rations left, out of pure habit before I wrote anything else, and set the rule down plain. The core retains rather than spawns. The dead are kept as records. A record can be restarted by speaking the name it was logged under. I wrote it in the flat, procedural hand the guild trained into every surveyor, the hand that made a fact into a fact and nothing more. Reading the page back, I found what else I'd put there. Under the rule, in the same steady script. His sentence, word for word. The way you'd copy down an instruction rather than an observation. Tell Fesk the 7th floor is not empty. I hadn't decided to carry that anywhere. I looked at the line a long time, at my own handwriting saying it back to me, as though the decision had already been made somewhere I hadn't been consulted, and I did not cross it out. Chapter 6. 9 Names. I didn't cross it out. I sat with the pen still wet against the page a while longer, then closed the ledger on Dassel's sentence, unfinished, meaning to come back to it, and went to survey the rest of floor 2. The wick in my lamp had burned down to a stub since morning, and the strap of my ration pouch rode a notch looser than it had at the shaft head. Counting had started to feel like the least honest thing I did all day. The mark took the corridor the moment I stepped into it, resolving joists and a collapsed archway into clean blue lines. And under the archway a second flag bloomed, where no flag should exist, in a decade-dormant site, occupied. I had learned, an hour ago, what that word actually meant here. I walked toward it, because certifying floors was the only arithmetic that still made sense to me, and because if I stopped walking toward the bad rooms I would have to sit down with the good ones and think. Room 6 held a woman on her knees, both hands pressed flat to the floor, as though the stone owed her something. Her lamp had gone out around her in a black halo, unburned oil pooled and still. She didn't look up when my boots scraped grit an arm's length from her. She never would. Her mouth worked through the same 4 or 5 shapes, over and over, too soft for me to make out, and I did not try harder to hear them, because I had already learned what listening cost. I logged her without speaking her name. Registry 3389. R coin. Stitched faint into a collar tag gone stiff with old blood. I wrote the number down and moved on before I could think about what her hands had been reaching for. Room 7 had 2 of them, side by side against a wall that had partly come down on top of whatever killed them. A boy young enough that his beard hadn't finished coming in, and an older man with a guild foreman's braid still knotted at his collar. Registry 3388. T. Hask. Registry 3392. G. Vask. Neither moved. Some records replayed a death. Some just held the last second of a life. Over and over. An image with no motion left in it at all. I logged both and did not linger long enough to decide which was worse. By the 12th room, my hand no longer hesitated on the latch before I opened the door, and that steadiness sat worse in my gut than anything behind it. Room 8 held Registry 3391, M. Soreth, in a storage alcove, half turned toward the door he never reached, one hand still braced on a lintel that it held. Room 9 held Registry 3393, A. Fen, folded small in a corner with a satchel of survey chalk spilled around him, sticks of it fanned out like something a child had arranged. Room 10 held Registry 3394, L. Baird. Room 11 held Registry 3395, J. Otway. Room 12 held Registry 3396. D. Marsh, the last of them, sprawled at the base of a stair with his neck at an angle that told the whole story without needing a loop to perform it.
Room 12. Retained. Registry 3396. D. Marsh.
9. I stood on the landing above Marsh's body and counted them again in my head, room by room, until the number held steady. 9 retained records, every one of them gilt leather, every one of them 11 years dead by the wear on their kit, every one of them a registry number that sat somewhere on the same brass plate bolted at the shaft head. The certainty of that opened under me like a trapdoor, the plate with my name on it. The expedition I had never served on, except that the guild had ruled it never happened at all, so it would never have to pay a crown of pension to any family standing outside a shaft head, asking where their surveyor had gone. I sat down on the top stair, because my legs asked to, and I opened the ledger to log the floor, and something else happened instead. My hand wrote Coin's name in full, Registry 3389. Then Hasks, and Vasks, and it kept going. Soreth, Fenn, Baird, Otway, Marsh, Dassel again at the end, though I'd already logged him a day ago. Every letter formed slow and careful in the same disciplined hand the guild had trained into me. The hand that made a thing a fact and nothing more. Certification required a stamp and a floor number. It did not require 9 names copied out with their full registry strings like a memorial. And I knew that. I knew it while I was doing it. And my fingers would not stop moving until the last number was down and the pen lifted on its own, like something had finished with it rather than me. I looked at the page a long time. 9 names in a column, mine not among them and somehow the only one that mattered to the list. Because I was the one still walking, and because 11 years ago I had gone up a rope while these 9 had stayed, and the paper the guild handed me afterward had called none of it real. It wasn't a choice. Not really. Habit had already sunk its teeth in. Certify it anyway. 400 crowns didn't ask whether the floor was haunted. Teodri's indenture didn't care what I'd found down here, only whether the bounty cleared. I told myself the 9 of them were past caring what stamp I put on the page above their names, and I did not entirely believe it, and I pressed the seal down onto the certification line regardless.
Floor 2. Dormant. Certified.
The ink took cleanly, blue-black and final. It sat on the page smooth and official, indistinguishable from the truth beside it. I had signed my name to something false once before. On paper the guild had put in front of me the week they buried a whole expedition under one word. My hand didn't shake this time either. I closed the ledger before I could read the 9 names a second time, and started down for the stair to floor 3. Because there was nowhere left on this floor that I could stand to stay. Chapter 7. Amended. Day 4. By my own count against the shaft head plate, though on the stair down to floor 3 that math felt like someone else's problem. The stair began at a landing barely wide enough for one body and a lamp, and guild code caught me there before the dark could. Regulation 9. Section 4. No surveyor continues a descent past a retained finding without first filing report with record. I had never filed one before. Training doesn't ask whether you've done a thing, only whether you know how. So I set the ledger against my knee, uncapped the ink, and wrote. I kept it plain, the shape the form wanted. Floor 2, 9 retained, guild registry numbers in order, dated of death 11 years back. Condition of remains intact and breathing. I wrote each number in the same order I'd written it into my own ledger an hour before, and my hand did not try to run ahead of me this time. Then, because leaving it out would have been its own kind of lie, I added the last line. Registry 3390. P. Dassel. Repeating message on death. Tell Fesk, the 7th floor is not empty. I didn't know who Fesk was. I filed it anyway, because that was the job, and closed the cap on the ink.
Report filed. Guild record.
The page under my hand went warm, the way skin goes warm before a fever sets in, and then it cooled, and that was the whole ceremony of it. I stood, shouldered the pack, and started down for the stair to floor 3, the regulation off my back, and my shoulders loose for the first time since I'd found Dassel. I made it 4 steps before the ledger inside the pack turned heavy against my spine, heavier than paper and brass clasps had any business being, and I stopped on the stair with my hand already reaching back for it before I'd decided to reach. I opened it under the lamp. The 3 completed pages, the entry log from the shaft head landing, floor 1, floor 2, had gone white, the paper itself unmarked and whole, the wall before a word blankness of something never painted, my 9 names and my dormant stamps, and the little cross-hatched hazard sketches, all lifted off the paper like frost, coming up off stone in the first hour of sun.
No.
I said, to no one, and pressed my thumb flat against the blank as if I could hold the ink down by weight. I tried to write over it. I dipped the pen and put Dassel's registry number back at the top of floor 2 in my own hand, fast, before whatever this was could finish, and the number sat there for the length of a breath and then thinned to nothing, the way a word dissolves off a slate wiped with a wet cloth, except no cloth had touched it. I wrote it again. It went again. I wrote it a 3rd time, harder, driving the nib until it nearly tore through, and the paper simply declined to keep it, the ink beating up and rolling off the fibers like water off tallow. New text climbed up from underneath instead, rising slowly into the page's grain, in a hand that was not mine, narrower, more upright, every letter closed at the top the way a clerk's hand closes letters, after 20 years of writing the same words for other people. Floor 1, dormant, certified. Floor 2, dormant, certified. No hazards, no 9 names, no message for a man I'd never met. Clean pages, official pages, the kind the guild pays 400 crowns a floor to receive, and at the foot of each one, in the same closed, patient hand, H. Fesk, steward of record. I found myself running a thumb across the name, and it wasn't flat against the page the way the rest of the amendment was. It sat raised, the barest ridge under my skin, as if the paper had been made to keep hold of that one word after it had let everything else go.
Record amended. Steward's overwrite privilege invoked. Certifying steward. H. Fesk, steward of record.
That's not yours to sign,
I said, the words coming out thin in the stairwell. Something I was saying to convince myself, not him. I sat down hard on the stone edge of the landing because my legs had stopped being consulted on the matter. I had spent a night copying 9 names I didn't have to copy, and a steward 2 floors and however many miles of rope above me had erased them in the time it took me to walk 4 steps. That was the whole of it, an amendment, filed and stamped, the way the guild had settled Reyd's expedition into one word 11 years back, without once asking what I'd seen. Sitting there, I stopped trying to write it back. An overwrite privilege replaced what happened with what the guild preferred, and stamped a name on the replacement so it could stand as truth. Fesk had used mine to erase the 9 dead, and put his own name where theirs should have been. Cold water sat in my chest, swallowed and unmelted. If Fesk could erase what I'd written, I didn't know whether he could erase what I'd found, whether Dassel was still down there bleeding out every 4 minutes, and telling nobody in particular to warn a man who'd apparently already known, or whether the room itself had been amended along with the page. There was only one way to learn which. I got up, and instead of going down toward floor 3, I went back the way I had come, fast enough that the lamp guttered against the draft of my own motion. The corridor outside room 4 had been logged an hour ago, clean blue lines holding steady the way the mark always held them, walls and door frame, and the crack in the floor I'd sketched myself. It held nothing now. The mark's outline didn't rise to meet my boots at all. The corridor going the flat, unclaimed dark of ground nobody has ever surveyed, as if I had never walked it, as if Dassel's room had never had a number. And where the far wall had been solid stone an hour before, there was a door. Chapter 8. The Voice on 4. The door stood where the wall had been an hour ago. Stone hinges, no handle, a seam at the top that hadn't existed when I'd sketched that same wall myself, and it had been the dullest line in the whole survey. I stood in the mouth of the corridor and stared at it for longer than a woman with her ration satchel gone slack under her palm should spend staring at anything, because a door where a wall used to be is the kind of fact that asks to be stared at until it makes sense. It never did.
You don't get to do that.
I said. To the door, to Fesk, to whoever was holding the pen on the other end of my ledger. My voice came out steadier than my pulse, which hadn't settled since floor 2. I didn't open it. Whatever Fesk could reach through a door he'd conjured, I wasn't going to hand him the satisfaction of watching me walk into it first. I turned my back on it instead and did the arithmetic that mattered. 2 floors certified, both blanked and refiled clean under his name, meaning the guild's copy of my expedition said I had logged nothing, found nothing, and was owed nothing. If I climbed back to the second landing now and rode the winch up on the strength of 2 warrant tokens, I'd surface with a ledger that agreed with him. No hazards, no 9 names, no message for a man who apparently didn't want it delivered. What Fesk couldn't overwrite from the surface was what he couldn't reach. Bodies, kit tags, registry plates sewn into collars, the physical grain of the thing. Ink he could erase. A dead man's boots he'd have to send someone down here to burn, and nobody was coming down here but me. It was, near enough to make me laugh, precisely the reasoning that had gotten 9 of them killed the last time I stood this close to a floor that wanted watching instead of leaving. Stay for the proof. Stay 1 room longer, because proof is the only currency that survives a ruling. I had believed that with my whole chest once, and the guild had ruled unrecorded anyway, and here I was believing it again, with a door full of stone breathing behind me. I went down instead of up. At the second landing, the warrant box waited exactly as I'd left it, iron dull with damp, and the token dropped into its slot with the same flat click the first one had made 3 floors up. Ascent warrant. 2 of 3 landings stamped. I pocketed the stub and kept moving before I could ask myself what a second stamp was worth against a door that hadn't existed an hour ago. The stair to floor 3 held nothing my mark hadn't already logged and lost. The blue lines came up thin and hesitant now, like the dungeon wasn't sure it wanted to commit to remembering me either, and I didn't trust a single line of it past arm's reach. Floor 3. I crossed in under 20 minutes without stopping to log a thing beyond the corridor I walked, because logging invites overwriting, and I had nothing left to protect. The stairwell down to 4 was collapsed at the landing. A slab dropped clean through the floor above sometime in 11 years of nobody checking, and I lost most of an hour finding the gap at its edge wide enough for my shoulders, lowering myself hand over hand on a rope I tied to a strut that groaned under half my weight, and held anyway. Floor 4 opened onto a long gallery, support columns marching off into dark my lamp didn't reach the end of, and my mark drew it clean and cautious, walls resolving a room width ahead of my boots like the dungeon had decided, down here, to be honest about what it was showing me. Then her voice came out of the dark.
Aussie.
The name hit before I could place why it mattered, because nobody had called me that in 11 years. Nobody but Reyd, who'd hung it on me the first week of the old expedition because Orem sounded too much like a surname and she wanted something that sounded like she owned me a little. Captain Reyd. Dead 11 years, by every account I'd ever been given, on a floor of this dungeon nobody had surveyed since. I ran, the exact thing I would have failed any apprentice for doing, off the logged line, past 2 doorways my mark hadn't finished drawing, lamp swinging wild enough that the shadows lurched sideways with every stride, toward a voice I knew, was calling from a throat that had stopped breathing over a decade ago. Every rule I had ever taught a junior surveyor said don't chase a sound in an unlogged dungeon, said a voice with no visible source is a hazard wearing a shape you'll forgive, said Dassel had died bleeding out on a loop, and Reyd could be doing the same thing, 4 rooms deeper, and my running toward it would change nothing about how it ended for her the first time.
Aussie, get the rope up.
The voice cracked on the last word exactly the way a person's does when they're shouting through effort. not through a record spinning on a fixed 4-minute wheel. And that was the detail that kept my legs moving past the point where thinking should have stopped them. I came around the last column into a room already lit blue by my own mark. Walls and exits resolved crisp and complete. No waiting. No ghost draft flicker. A finished survey. Hazard-free. Dimensions clean to the inch. Empty. No Reyd. No body. No kit. Only dust. Settled undisturbed across the floor for longer than I'd been alive to walk on it. Not one print broken in it. And in the corner of the drawn plan, where my mark logs a surveyor's initials the way it always has, sat my own hand's cramped little signature, VO, dated in a script that was unmistakably mine, on a day I hadn't lived yet. I stood in the doorway, breath uneven, silence folding back in where her voice had been. The understanding arrived slow, and then all at once, cold ahead of any words for it, I hadn't run toward Reyd at all. I'd run toward whatever had already surveyed this room for me, and it had been waiting to see if I would. Chapter 9. One Way. I walked out of that room instead of running. Running was what had gotten me here, chasing a voice that wore Reyd's grief like a coat that fit nobody. My mark had drawn that chamber before I ever crossed its threshold, had signed my own initials to a day I hadn't lived, and if I let that thought keep unspooling, I would stand in this corridor until my lamp guttered out. So I didn't let it. I turned my back on the empty room, checked my ledger against the corridor behind me, and started walking toward the third landing, because 2 tokens stamped and 1 owed was the only arithmetic I trusted anymore. Day 5. 7 days of rations left, if the tally still held.
Third landing.
I said out loud, just to hear something that wasn't my own name in a stranger's mouth.
Stamp the token. Go up. That's all today has to be.
The walk back took longer than it should have. Floor 4's corridors ran longer on the return than they had on the way in, my mark filling them in section by section as I passed, blue lines stitching themselves into place a half step behind my boots. I kept my eyes on the lines and not on the doors. I had learned that much, at least. The landing came up as landings always did on Bellow Deep, a widened stretch of shaft wall with an iron warrant box bolted into the stone, a slot in its face the size of a coin, and above it, the little brass plaque that had read, on the first 2 landings, warrant active, insert to claim. I came around the last bend already reaching for the token stub in my belt pouch, already rehearsing the small satisfaction of hearing it click home. The plaque had changed. Sealed. Steward's authority. The letters weren't stamped fresh. They sat under a film of the same gray dust as everything else on this floor, as though they'd always said that, as though I'd misread them wrong twice already, and only now gotten close enough to see it plain. Below the words, where the coin slot should have taken my stub, there was only a rectangle of blank iron, no slot left in it, no seam to show where one had ever been. A door that had decided, sometime between my last landing and this one, to stop being a door.
No.
I said, and heard how thin it came out.
No. I stamped 2. I stamped 2 and…
I didn't finish it. I already knew stamping the first 2 landings didn't matter to a box that had been welded shut somewhere above me, by someone who had never once come down here to see it done. I stood there a moment with my hand still half raised, the token stub warm from my own palm, and the floor of my plan gave out from under me, exactly like floor 4 had given under Reyd's voice. Not all at once, but in that sick half-second where the ground goes before the mind has caught up to it. I had built the whole shape of the last 2 days around 3 landings, 3 tokens, 1 ride up. I had not built anything around what happened if the ride up stopped existing. I made myself breathe before I did anything else. When I went to tuck the token stub back into my belt pouch, my arm answered half a second slow, like it belonged to someone else, and the stub missed and dropped. I had to feel along the stone lip for it, at the edge of the lamplight before my fingers closed on it again. Panic was a thing I had trained myself out of on worse floors than this one, apparently not all the way out. Then I went to the winch line instead, because the warrant box wasn't the only way a shaft answered a pull. The line ran up the center of the landing shaft, taut and dark, disappearing into the black above the lamp's reach. I'd used it before, hand over hand on the platform ropes, the fibers answering weight with weight. I wrapped both hands around it and hauled. 3 long pulls, calling up into the dark, the way crews had signaled for 100 years before anybody bothered inventing a warrant token.
Line's clear.
I shouted, and the shaft ate the words without giving any of them back.
Haul away. 1 surveyor, 3 tokens short 1. Line's clear.
Nothing answered, and I let myself wonder, in the half-second before I pulled again, whether the man who'd doubled my safety line at the shaft head back on floor 1 was even still down here to hear it, or whether Fesk had pulled him off the drum, along with everything else he'd sealed against me. I hauled harder, put my whole weight into it, the rope biting instead of giving, fibers dragging against skin that had already spent 4 days gripping ropes and rock. I kept at it past the point where it stopped being useful and became only a way of not standing still, hauling in short vicious strokes until the burn in my palms turned to something wetter, something that stuck the rope to my hands when I let go and pulled away in thin strings when I finally did. I looked down at what the line had done to me. Then the reason it hadn't answered came together, plain and cold, from 3 separate facts I'd been carrying without adding them. A token was proof, not just permission. The winch didn't read tokens as a tally. It read them as proof. Proof that a body on the end of the line was a surveyor still owed passage, not salvage the guild had already written off. A missing token didn't mean forgotten to a mechanism that only understood tallies. It meant unauthorized. 2 stamps and a stub in my pouch made me a woman, with an incomplete claim, and an incomplete claim, to whatever logic ran that winch, looked exactly like a body it had no writ to bring up. I sat down on the cold lip of the landing, with my palms open on my knees, and for a while I didn't do anything at all, except watch them bleed in the lamplight, and think that Fesk had found a way to seal a door without ever touching it. That was when the sound came up from below. It started low enough that I took it for the shaft's own draft, air moving through old stone. Then it shaped itself into a syllable, then 2, then my own name, said in a voice that wasn't Dassel's flat dying register, and wasn't Reyd's either.
Vesa,
it said, from somewhere down the black throat of the stairwell. Then, layered under it, a second voice, rougher, saying it half a beat behind, then a third.
Vesa, Vesa, Vesa.
I counted them the way I'd counted names on floor 2 without meaning to. 1 voice, then 3, then 5, climbing towards some number I already dreaded knowing before I finished the count, all of them saying my name in a chorus that had never once, on any floor of this deep, said anyone's name but the dead's own. Chapter 10. The Unrecorded Expedition. 9. I stopped counting there because 9 was the number I already had, and having it didn't make the sound of it easier to sit inside. 9 voices came up out of the stairwell dark saying my name, in a round that never resolved, each one a half beat behind the last, none of them ever quite letting the sound before it finish dying. I backed off the landing into the nearest logged doorway and put a wall of certified stone between me and the stairs. The wall held. The voices didn't follow it. They didn't need to. They knew exactly where I was standing. They'd been saying so. I sat down inside my own logged blue lines, back against the corner where 2 walls met. A corner was one thing this deep hadn't figured out how to put a door in yet, and counted my own breaths until they came in on a rhythm I recognized as mine. 4 in, hold, 6 out, again, sealed warrant above me. 9 dead voices below, wearing a chorus I'd never heard the deep use on anyone but its own retained. No rope, no winch answer. 11 days of rations, 4 of them gone, and my hands had gone a color I didn't like in the lamplight. I had done worse math than this and come out the other side. I had never done it honest. My ledger sat in my lap, the spare cover worn soft at the corner where my thumb had rubbed it 1,000 nights on other jobs. I opened it past floor 6, past the blank page I hadn't requisitioned, and found a leaf under that one I hadn't looked at in 11 years, because I'd never had to. Guild issue. Unlined. The kind meant for a person's own words, not for certifying anything to anybody. I'd carried it that long without writing on it. Sitting there with the chorus counting down below me, I understood what I'd been saving it for. Nothing. Never. That was the whole plan, and it had worked right up until tonight. I wrote on it anyway. I was on the Bellow Deep expedition. 5 words, and my hand shook worse over them than it had over any hazard sketch on any floor of this dungeon. Surveyor. Second seat. Under Captain I. Reyd. 11 years ago this coming autumn. I set the nib down, watched the ink go from wet black to dry, and didn't stop there.
I went up the rope first.
I said it out loud before I put it on the page, and my own voice came back thin off the stone, smaller than I meant it. A record keeps only what happened and never what didn't. The same rule that had painted false blue lines across floors I'd never set foot on wouldn't paint a voice that had never been spoken. So if the chorus below was saying my name, it was because someone below had said it that day too, while I went up the rope and none of them did. Reyd had given the order at the collapse. Not a request. The flat command voice she kept for nothing but a real emergency. Up, Aussie. Now. You first. And I'd gone, because you obeyed Ilma Reyd the way you obeyed a dropped stone, without arguing the physics of it. I hadn't looked back before I cleared the gap. 11 years I'd called that mercy. It was cowardice, and calling it a captain's order for 11 years was how I'd kept from saying so. I wrote that too. I did not look back. 4 words. They cost more ink, more of something, than the rest of the page combined, and my hand was shaking hard enough by the last word that the K trailed off into a scratch. 9 surveyors stayed on the lower floors that day. 9 names I knew by heart now, because I'd copied them once without meaning to, and once on purpose, in a report Fesk erased before the ink finished drying. I made it up the rope alone. The guild took my statement. 6 weeks later the ruling came down. Bellow Deep expedition. Unrecorded. A clerical nullity. Filed and closed. No dissent having occurred as far as the guild's books were concerned. No pensions for 9 families. No hazard settlement. No survivor's stipend. Nothing owed by anyone to anyone, because on paper nobody had gone down that shaft at all. They offered me a hearing to contest it. I still had the letter by heart, every clause of it lodged where I couldn't dig it out. A hearing meant testifying to what happened on that floor, in order, under oath, with a board of stewards asking why the second-seat surveyor came up topside and unhurt, while the captain and 8 others didn't come up at all. I knew what that hearing would sound like before I ever sat in the chair. I knew the word they'd reach for, politely, in the minutes. I signed the acceptance form instead. Unrecorded stood. I took the silence over the accusation, because the silence was at least a thing I thought I could carry. Silence has a price, though, and the guild collects it from whoever's standing nearest when the bill comes due. Teodri was 19. The debt that turned up on our family's ledger 8 months later had no name on it but Orem, and my brother put his own name under an indenture contract to cover it before I even knew the bill existed, because that's what he does when his sister won't say out loud what she's paying for. I'd never told him why. 11 years, and I had never once put down, in ink, in my own hand, the sentence I'd just written on this page. The indenture is the price of my signature, and I put my name to it to keep from saying what I'd done. I sat with that a long moment, the lamp guttering low against the stone. Then I turned my thoughts to the plate. The roster at the shaft head, bolted brass, my name and my registry number scraped into it under Reyd's own command. 11 years before I could have written it there myself. I'd spent every hour since the shaft head calling it a forgery, because a forgery was a thing a person could survive believing, and the alternative wasn't. But a forgery corrodes at its own rate. Fresher ink sits differently in old brass. I'd scraped that plate myself and found no seam, no second layer, no lie laid over a truth. It wasn't fresher. It was original. Struck the day Reyd mustered her crew, and logged her second seat surveyor by name. The 1 hour the expedition ever legally existed on paper, before the guild's ruling unmade it, before some clerk's amendment blanked the record, the same way Fesk had blanked my floors from a desk I'd never see. The plate wasn't a forgery. The plate was the one copy of the truth nobody had gotten around to overwriting yet. I closed the ledger on the wet ink and listened to the chorus below thin itself back toward quiet, one voice dropping out, then another, until it was almost still enough to believe I'd invented the whole thing. Almost. Then, far up the shaft above the sealed warrant box, past 3 landings and a rope I no longer owned, something began to pay out chain. Chapter 11. Salvage. The chain kept coming, link over link, a sound with a rhythm behind it, someone's hand on a crank, turning slow and even. High up the shaft, a second light flickered once, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it. I stood at the sealed warrant box and let myself believe, for the length of maybe 6 links, that a hand meant a person, and a person on the other end of a rope meant help.
Rope first.
I said, out loud, to nobody, because saying the plan kept it a plan and not a hope. A thin, dark thread lowered itself past the second landing, past the gap where the stairwell had dropped away under me 2 days before. Fine linked chain, the kind the guild used for instrument drops rather than rescues. At the end of it, swinging a slow arc in the lamplight, hung something flat and pale. A page. It came down slower than gravity alone would have carried it. Someone up top, paying it out by hand, careful with it, unwilling to let it arrive broken. It cleared the second landing, and the particular clarity that comes right before a bad thing lands told me whoever was turning that crank knew exactly where I was standing and meant to put the page in my hands and nowhere else. It stopped an arm's length above my head, forcing me to reach up for it. Deliberate, that. A small cruelty dressed as procedure. The seal was guild wax, unbroken, stamped with a crest I'd signed under 100 times without looking at it twice. 2 crossed survey rods over an open book. Under the seal, in a clerk's careful hand, my name. My registry number. Correct. Both of them. None of the small transpositions a forger makes when he's copying a number he doesn't understand. I broke the seal because there was nothing else to do with a sealed page addressed to you at the bottom of a dead shaft. I unfolded it, and my lamplight found the first line before I was ready to read it.
Reclamation writ. Subject, Vesa Aurum. Registry 4471. Status, unlogged salvage.
Under the header, the clerk's hand again, tighter now, like he'd been told to hurry. By authority of the Bellow Deep Steward of Record, the above-named surveyor's contracted engagement is terminated for cause. The subject is declared unlogged salvage of the Bellow Deep site, effective upon delivery of this writ to the named subject. All prior certifications, warrants, and mark privileges are void. I read effective upon delivery twice, not trusting it the first time, and on the second reading, my mark went out. Not dimmed. Out. All at once, with nothing in between. No flicker, no fading, just absence where light had been a moment before. The blue lines that had held the landing steady around me for 2 days dropped all at once. The warrant box, the door frame, the seam where the stairwell had once continued down before Fesk's overwrite had eaten it. Walls, floor, the memory of an exit, gone together, and what rose in their place was outright absence. No stone at all. The lamp burning on into less and less for it to show. My knees found the floor before I decided to kneel. The page was still in my hand, still real, the one solid fact left to me, and I did not let go of it. Reading past the header a second time was the only work my hands still knew how to do, and work was the only thing standing between me and the noise trying to climb up out of my chest. The writ's second clause was shorter, and colder for it. A writ takes hold at the moment it reaches its subject, and only if the subject is named correctly. No further action is required of the steward, the surveyor, or the site. There was a third clause beneath it, shorter still. No name held elsewhere in the deep's own record may be claimed twice. The second claim collides with the first, and both are voided against the holder. Named correctly, and not held elsewhere first, that was what the writ was staking its claim on now. I turned the phrase over the way I'd turned Dassel's registry number, hunting the seam where it stopped being true and not finding one. No threat needed dressing up as procedure. This was procedure, unadorned, and procedure didn't raise its voice to do its work. Fesk hadn't needed to march down here and unmake me himself. He'd needed a clerk, a piece of paper, and my correct name. The deep had done the rest with the same patience it did everything else. Reclassified me the instant the name and the person lined up, exactly as it had reclassified 9 dead guild surveyors as retained record instead of corpse, 11 years back, the instant their names lined up with their bodies. I sat in that thought a long moment, in the black, with the lamp making a small yellow room of itself, and nothing beyond its edge but absence. Somewhere down there the chorus had gone quiet again. My palms throbbed where the rope had opened them. Day 6. If the ration marks I'd scored into my satchel strap that morning still meant anything. 6 days left, and no clear claim on counting them, since the guild's own paper said the woman doing the counting no longer existed. I was, by the guild's own paper, no longer a surveyor of anything. I was inventory. And that was when the laugh came up out of me, ugly and short, more air than sound, because for one bright, stupid moment I thought the new clause meant I was safe. My name had already been held, correctly, 11 years before any clerk up top thought to write it twice. Reyd had put Viorum on the crew plate before the last descent, bolted at the shaft head where every surveyor's name waited for a return. Held elsewhere. Held first. Then I placed the plate properly. Shaft head meant surface, and surface had never been deep record. Reyd's brass, guild property, bolted to stone that had never once answered to the steward's authority. The deep had never logged that name as its own to lose, so there was nothing here for the writ to collide with. It had a clean field to work in, and it took me in it, and the laugh had nothing kind left in it by the time it finished, because the joke, it turned out, was on me. I stopped laughing before it turned into the other thing. I folded the writ once, along its crease, and put it inside my coat rather than let it go. Evidence outlasts erasure. I'd learned that much from Fesk himself. Then I sat there with no mark, no walls, nothing under my boots I could call floor, only the small, stubborn circle my lamp still owned. 9 names were still in my ledger, in my own hand, spelled correctly, and correct names were the one thing down here that moved something. I had no map. I had 9 fixed points in a dark that used to be a dungeon and was now, as far as any guild record could prove, nowhere at all.
Dassel,
I said into the black, low, testing the shape of it in my own mouth, before I trusted it with anything more. Chapter 12. Restart.
Dassel,
I said again. Quiet, testing it against the dark like a latch I already knew was locked. The dark answered with sound instead of light, cloth dragging over stone. A held breath let out wrong, and then the wet catch in his voice that I already knew was coming, because it had happened once before. Whole, in a room I could no longer see. Coin, don't. Get her out first. And under that, fainter, the small tearing noise that was a man's hand trying to hold his own stomach shut. I had done this to him. I had done it on purpose, and I was going to do it 8 more times before the night let me stop, and there was no version of that fact I could write down that made it anything other than what it was. My throat worked and nothing came up. I let it not come up. Grief was a thing I could requisition later, on the surface, in a room with a door that closed. Down here it was cargo, and I could not carry it and a bearing at the same time. I held still and let the sound tell me where he was. His voice came from low and slightly left of where my last logged wall had stood, which meant the wall was still there in whatever sense mattered to sound even if my mark no longer drew it for me. I turned until his dying was directly ahead, and walked 11 paces, the same 11 I'd counted the first time I surveyed that room, the count still good in my ledger, in my own hand. Then I put my palm flat against stone that hadn't existed a breath ago, as far as my eyes were concerned. Doorway. I ran my fingers along the frame until I found the gap, stepped through, and Dassel's voice fell behind me, resetting itself for a second time, to a beginning I would not go back to hear again. One fixed point. I needed at least two to make a line worth trusting. A sailor doesn't steer by one headland light. He steers by the gap between two of them.
Coin.
I said, and held still to hear it through. Her dying was shorter than Dassel's, more startled, a young woman's voice cracking on a name I didn't recognize, someone she'd loved probably, gone unnamed in the record because her stat sheet only cared what killed her, not what she'd wanted to say to. I took her bearing off my left shoulder, held Dassel's silence as my second mark, and walked the angle between them until the two lines in my head crossed at a point my boots confirmed was a corner. Sharp. Real. The kind of thing the dark couldn't lie about, even with my mark dead. I went through the roster in the order I'd logged them, because order was the only structure I had left, and I was not going to spend what nerve remained deciding on a better one. Hask's voice came thin and almost bored, a man narrating his own death like a checklist, and I used him only for an angle, not a room. I stopped listening after the second sentence and held there, refusing it a third. Vask. I lingered at longer than I meant to, because Vask begged, and begging has a shape that doesn't let go of you quickly. I stood in the black with my palms flat against my own thighs, so I wouldn't reach toward a sound that had no body attached to it anymore. And when it looped back to the beginning, I walked forward anyway, into the space his voice had vacated, because that was the only kind of mercy I had to give him, passing through instead of standing still. Soreth, Fen, Baird. Each one cost the same fixed price, and I paid it the same way. Flat, deliberate, a woman counting coin she didn't want to spend, and each one bought me another room's worth of true dark instead of the false kind. I was building a floor plan out of grief, the way Fesk had built his out of ink, except mine couldn't be overwritten from the surface, because it wasn't written anywhere. It lived in the last 4 minutes of the 9 dead, and in my willingness to make them live those minutes again. By Otway my hands had stopped shaking, and the steadiness sat wrong in my palms, wronger than the shaking had ever felt.
Marsh.
I said. The 9th name, the last room I'd logged on floor 2, the one my hand had written down along with all the others without my permission, the night I stamped that floor dormant for 400 crowns I was never going to see. Marsh's dying was the quietest of the 9. Almost polite, a man apologizing to no one in particular for taking so long about it. And I took his bearing and walked it the way I'd walked the other 8, palm out, counting paces I had no ledger entry for anymore, because there was no floor 2 here to match against. I had walked past every room I knew existed and kept walking, because Marsh's voice kept receding instead of holding still, pulling me forward when none of the others had. My boot found the edge before my hand found the wall. Stone dropped away under the toe of it into open air, and my lamp, when I dropped it to swing low, showed me the first 3 steps of a stair going down, cut clean, no rust on the treads, and above it, an arch worn smooth by hands that were not mine. Dust lay thick across the top step, already broken by a second line of prints, boot-shaped, leading down, a size larger than my own, and smudged at the edges from more than one crossing. There was no number painted on it. Every stair I had descended since the winch platform had one. Chalked, stamped, a floor's whole legal existence reduced to a single character over a doorway. This arch had a pale rectangle where a number should have stood, scrubbed or never written, and Marsh's voice had gone silent behind me the moment I found it, as if the 9th name had only ever been a finger pointing at this one place. I stood at the top of it a long moment, lamp shaking a small circle over steps that led to a floor the guild's own schedule had never admitted existed. Going down was no longer a choice I was making. It was the only direction left that I hadn't already used up. Chapter 13. Captain Reyd. The stair led out into a room with no number over its arch, and no rust on its treads, and the air changed the moment I reached the bottom step. gone cold and still. The stillness of a room nobody had breathed in for a long time. My lamp found a desk before it found anything else. A folding field desk, guild issue, the kind that came apart into a pack frame, still set up with its legs sunk crooked into old grit. And past it, kneeling at a collapsed beam with one arm flung up toward a ceiling that had come down around her 11 years ago, was Reyd.
"Rope's clear,"
she said, to nobody, to the dark, the same 4 words looping under her breath, worn into the same groove Dassel's 4 had cut before him.
"Go, go, up, Aussie, now, don't look back at me, go."
I knew the shape of her before I recognized her face. I had spent 3 years learning that shape from behind, on ropes, at the lip of every hole she'd ever ordered me through first. My legs folded under me, and I sat down hard on the cold floor, standing no longer something they'd agreed to do. Whatever ration I had left for today, I was spending it here, kneeling in front of a woman who'd been dead longer than I'd been surveying anything. I let it play once. Her arm dropped when the beam finished falling, and the rope she was gesturing toward went slack and empty because I was already gone, hauled up into daylight while she stayed under. My hand rose an inch off my knee before I forced it flat again. Then I said her name and rank the way I'd learned to say the others, full and correct, and made her die again on purpose so I could hear the rest of it. The record did not restart where I expected. Dassel's 4 minutes had been the whole of him. Bleed, message, silence, again. Reyd's 4 minutes ended and kept going. She got up off her knees. She dragged the beam clear with her own hands, wrapped the arm that would not stop bleeding, and sat down at the folding desk to write. And the light in the room did not change, but something in the air did. The specific weight of days passing that a body registers before a mind will admit it. Candle stubs that hadn't been there on the way in crowded the desk's corner now, a dozen of them, burned to nothing. She hadn't died on that beam. She'd died here, later, still working.
"Chains down again."
She said, to the desk now, not to the rope.
"Third message this week, same question. Fine. I'll put it plain enough. A steward reads it once."
She unfolded a page, real paper, not mark ink, a physical letter that had come down some line the way Fesk's writ had come down mine, and something in my chest went tight at the sight of it.
Spawns stopped. Call it capacity, not dormancy. 7 floors, and it ran out of room to keep what it kills, so it stopped killing, because there's nowhere left to put the bodies, but where the bodies already are.
She laughed once, short and ugly, the same sound that had come out of my own mouth more than once this week.
Sign that dormant, if it helps you sleep. Wrong word. Call it finished. There's a difference, Halloran, and you signed the schedule same as I did.
I sat in the cold and listened to a woman, 11 years dead, answer a question I had asked out loud without meaning to. She wasn't answering me. She was answering him, reading Fesk's letter into a room that had no one left to hear it. The timing only felt like conversation, because I'd arrived in the middle of one that had already happened, its shape fixed forever, the moment she wrote it down, and died holding the pen. She kept writing, past whatever had killed her, wound gone black and unbandaged in the last of the candlelight, and near the end of the page her hand steadied enough to add one more line that had nothing to do with Fesk's question.
Put Orem's name on the crew plate, before we go down,
she said, to herself now, remembering rather than reporting, the order she must have given topside days before any of it.
Whatever they rule after, unrecorded, undocumented, whatever word Fesk wants, the plate's brass, and the ink's mine, and brass doesn't take amendments the way a ledger does. If the girl ever comes back down here, I want something in this place that still says she was mine to command, and that I sent her up first, because it was the right order, not because I doubted her.
The loop reached its end there, mid-breath, her pen still moving toward a last word she never finished. The desk and the candles folded back into stillness, 11 years collapsing out of the room in the same breath, into a kneeling woman with one arm raised at an empty rope. I did not restart her a third time. I didn't have two more of her deaths in me, not for one more sentence. Her body was 3 feet from the desk, what was left of it, kit tags gone green, and pinned under one wrist a slate she'd scratched by hand, rather than trusted to a mark that could be overwritten from the surface. The same instinct I'd had about room 4's door arrived at 11 years before I'd needed it. I turned the slate to my lamp and read the last line she'd carved into it separately from the letter. Deeper. Meant to outlast paper. 7th floor isn't finished. It never stopped taking, down there. It doesn't wait until it's done to write, either. I've read my own hand on a survey I hadn't walked yet, dated 3 days ahead of me, like it already knew what I meant to do before I did. Whatever the deep hasn't gotten around to keeping, that's where it waits, and it keeps its books ahead of you. I knelt over a dead captain's handwriting, too late by 11 years to be any use to her, and the bounty I'd walked in here to earn came apart in my hands like wet paper. Dormant meant nothing. Certified meant a lie with a steward's name on it. Every crown of Teodri's freedom had been sitting on top of a floor that was still, after 11 years, hungry. Somewhere below me, past a passage I hadn't logged because I no longer had anything to log it with, something shifted stone against stone, patient and unhurried, in the direction the slate had pointed. Chapter 14. Signed. I did not go toward the sound. Reyd's slate had said the deep kept moving in the dark below floor 7, taking whatever it hadn't yet finished storing, and 11 years of her handwriting had earned enough trust from me that I backed away instead of walking closer. My lamp threw its small circle over the stair I'd come down. I climbed it with my spine crawling the whole way, listening for a second scrape that never came. At the top, in the dark that used to be floor 2, I stood with my back to the stair and counted to 30 before my hands stopped shaking enough to trust them with the ledger. The ration strap had 2 fewer notches free than it needed, gone thinner than I wanted to count out loud. Then, because shaking wasn't a plan and I needed one, I opened the ledger. The blanked pages sat where Fesk had put his lie over my work. Floors 1 and 2, both of them clean and empty of everything but dormant. Certified, and his signature beneath it. I ran my thumb along the ink out of old habit, the same motion I'd use on a rope before I trusted it, and the paper wasn't flat where it should have been flat. The 6 words of his name had a grain to them, faint ridges under my fingertip, like a hand had come down on that exact spot more than once. More than a signature, a stack of them, pressed one into the last until the fibers remembered the motion. I sat with that a while. The plate at the shaft head had carried my name first and meant nothing when the writ came for it. Surface brass, guild property, never logged as a thing the deep meant to keep. This ink was different, pressed into the deep's own stone, not the guild's. The deep kept the dead where they fell and made them run their last hour on a loop nobody asked for. It had kept Reyd for years after her death, still working, still logging, because she'd never stopped being a working record. An amendment, Fesk's own mechanism, the one he'd used to erase my floors, required his seal name entered into it, every time, even the false ones. If the deep held on to anything a person left inside its own walls, and a signature was a thing a man left there on purpose, over and over, for as many years as he'd rubber-stamped guild reviews from the surface, without ever once climbing down to look, then it had 11 years of him in these walls, and none of it was memory or second-hand story. His hand, still wet, still signing. I thought of Dassel's 4 minutes running on a loop because I'd spoken his name at his door. Fesk wasn't dead. Speaking his name wouldn't do anything. And some part of me, Reyd's part, insisted on trying it anyway, standing in the dark and saying Halloran Fesk, steward of record, to a corridor that gave me back nothing but the sound of my own voice. No loop started. No hour repeated. Whatever kept him here wasn't tied to a death that hadn't happened. But the ridges under my thumb hadn't come from nowhere.
Dassel,
I said, at the threshold of his room, because it was the fastest bearing back to the one place I knew for certain Fesk had signed something. The corridor outside room 4. the wall that had become a door the same hour my floors went blank. He started from the beginning again. 4 minutes I already knew by heart. His hand pressed to a wound that had opened before I was born. 3 repetitions of a message meant for a man I hadn't met yet. I didn't stay for the end of it. I used his voice as a compass point, as I had 8 times before, and walked away from it while he was still bleeding, because that was the only kindness I had left to give him, and it wasn't much of one. The corridor beyond his room hadn't changed. The door that used to be a wall stood ajar, just as I'd left it, and past the gap the black went on further than my lamp could answer for. I didn't go through it. I knelt at the frame instead, where the stone still carried the raw edge of Fesk's erasure, and pressed the blanked ledger page flat against it, the way you'd press a rubbing against a gravestone. It came up slow. The first signature surfaced clean and recent. The one from 2 days ago. The one that had stolen my floors. Beneath it, fainter, another, dated a year back. Beneath that, another, and another under that. I turned my lamp close and copied them as they rose, one under the last, filling the page he'd emptied with the truth he'd never meant to leave lying around. 12 signatures now. The most recent still raw on top, from 2 days past, and beneath it, 11 more, one for every year he never came down. Each of the 11, a cheerful little lie about a dungeon he had never once come down to see, each one certifying Bellow Deep dormant, while 9 of his own surveyors sat retained 2 floors below his desk. My breath stayed even this time. I wrote his name back into my own record until I ran out of room, and when I was done, I had something no steward's overwrite from the surface could reach. It belonged to the deep now, the same as everything else it kept. I stayed kneeling there and stopped, just for a minute, because my hand had cramped shut around the pen and wouldn't open on its own. The minute ran long. I recopied a smudged line I decided wasn't smudged after all, said Dassel's name once more into the dark past the doorway, not for a bearing this time, just to hear something that wasn't my own pen scratching, and lost track of how long I'd been sitting there before I noticed the light past the frame had changed. No wind moved the door. No hinge groaned first and warned me. It simply stood wide where it had stood ajar, and the black beyond it wasn't black anymore. A second lamp burned somewhere past the frame, steady, someone else's hand behind the light. I came up off my knees with the ledger pressed to my chest, like it could stop something, and past the doorway, on ground the shaft map had only ever drawn as an empty rectangle, a man stood in survey leathers, so new the buckles still caught the light.
You found the pages.
Fesk said. Chapter 15. The 7th Floor. I held the ledger tight against my chest and made myself look at him instead of away. I had spent this whole descent being lied to by men who never had to stand in front of me while they did it, and here, finally, was one who did.
Vesa.
I said.
Not Aussie. You don't get that one.
No.
Fesk agreed, and stepped through the doorway onto a floor that had never, on any guild map, had a floor to step onto.
I don't suppose I do. I unsealed the box myself, if you're wondering. Rode down on the same chain that lowered your writ to you. The one thing coming down that no signature could undo.
His lamp threw his shadow long across ground that resolved oddly as he crossed it. Not clean. My own mark had never drawn a room clean either, its lines settling in patches, a wall finishing itself a beat after his boot passed it, as though floor 7 were still being written and had simply learned to keep pace with a visitor. He did not come at me. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, wanting me to see he wasn't reaching for anything, and looked at the ledger against my chest with the plain, unhidden want of someone asking for the last coin in a room.
Give me the pages, Vesa. I'll get you a token for the 3rd landing myself. Guild authority. You'd be topside by morning.
You sealed the warrant box yourself.
I said.
You'd unseal it to save your name, not to save mine. I've read your handwriting 11 times over now. Fesk. I know what it looks like when you're covering something.
He didn't flinch. Worse than if he had.
Then, Let me cover it in front of you instead of behind your back, since apparently that's the version you'll believe.
He drew a slow breath, and when he spoke again, it was in the register of a man reading a report he had given so many times the grief had worn smooth.
Ilma Reyd's last logged numbers for the collapse. I read them the week after she went missing, when I was still junior enough to be the one who read things. Bellow Deep wasn't slowing. It was full. Every retained record, on every floor, held exactly as it holds Dassel, as it holds your 9. That's not the core resting. That's the core, with nowhere left to put the next one.
I opened my mouth, some protest half-formed, something about Dassel, about the 9, and closed it again without a sound. Let him finish. I owed him that much, if only to see whether he'd earned it. Open this shaft to a full crew again. Log it live on the guild's books, and you don't spawn 9 deaths over 11 years. You spawn everything it's already holding, all at once, on every floor still wired to a working shaft. I did the arithmetic in a stairwell, with Reyd's own hand shaking on the page. 211 confirmed. That's before you count who we send down after.
So you certified it dormant.
So I certified it dormant,
He said, flat. No shame in it, only the tired weight of a debt he'd decided long ago to keep paying.
every year, my own hand, my own seal, because a dead dungeon on the guild ledger is a dungeon nobody orders reopened, and a live one is a lawsuit waiting for a body count. I traded 9 of the retained, already unreachable, and 1 brother's freedom for 211 lives that hadn't happened yet and never will now. I would sign it again tonight, Vesa. I have never once told myself I wouldn't.
I wanted an answer that would take the ground out from under that. Some clean line that proved him a monster instead of a man doing sums. It didn't come. The sums were not wrong. Fesk's arithmetic and mine ran the same machine. His bounty against bodies. Mine against Teodri's contract. Neither of us had asked the 9 on floor 2 what they thought their deaths were worth.
Dassel asked for you.
I said instead, because it was the one true thing I had left that wasn't an argument.
4 minutes, on a loop. 11 years running. Bleeding out the same way every time. And the only sentence he kept was for you. Tell Fesk, the 7th floor is not empty.
For the first time since the door had opened, Fesk looked past me, not at the ledger, not at me, but down into the dark beyond his own lamp's circle, where the walls were still finishing themselves room by room, as though something back there hadn't stopped waiting to be logged. Something in his jaw moved, small, involuntary.
I know it isn't.
He said, quiet now.
I've known for 11 years. That's why I never came down until now.
He held his hand out for the ledger anyway. I did not hand it to him. What I did instead was open my coat, past the ledger, to the sealed page folded flat inside its lining, since the 3rd landing. The writ that had named me Vesa Aurum, unlogged Salvage, in a clerk's careful hand, and Fesk's own seal beneath it. I had carried it unburned because it was evidence. It was also, still, a physical page that had once reached a subject and taken hold of them by name.
You taught me the rule.
I said, unfolding it between us.
A subject named correctly, and the claim takes the moment the page reaches them. And a name already held elsewhere in the deep can't be claimed twice. The second claim collides with the first.
I crossed out my own name where the clerk had written it, and beneath it, in my surveyor's hand, I wrote his, the same seal name I had pressed off 11 amended thresholds and copied into my own pages until the ink was mine to spend. H. Fesk, Steward of Record.
You've been signing yourself into this place, year after year, 11 times over. That's a name already held, Fesk. I'm just delivering the second claim. The Deep never once asked whose authority pressed a claim onto its pages, only whose ink was last, and still living. That's the whole of the power you used against me. Every time you overwrote mine. I'm just the one still living.
Vesa.
He started, reaching for the page the way a man reaches for a debt he thought he'd finished paying, and his hand closed on it. Closing on it was already the same as receiving it.
Steward of record. H. Fesk. 11 entries retained. Second naming received.
The floor did not wait for him to finish being afraid of it. It took him mid-word. The last syllable of my name cut clean off his tongue, and the half-built walls of floor 7 finished themselves all at once around the space where he had been standing. Quietly, completely, like ink settling once a pen finally reaches the bottom line. My coat lining went warm against my ribs. When I looked down, the writ that had named me Salvage was curling black at its edges, its ink running backward off the paper, until there was nothing in my hand but a clean, unmarked sheet, and then not even that. I stood alone on a floor no map had ever drawn, my mark still dark, the winch 3 floors and a sealed landing above me. The ledger was heavier in my hands than it had been all night, mine to write in now, for whatever that was worth, with a page still open where his name had just gone in ahead of the ink. Chapter 16, page 7. I slept, the first time since floor 1, and woke to the lamp guttering low. A full night gone, the first my count had lost to sleep instead of walking, which put me a day further out than I wanted to be. I checked the ration pouch by feel before I checked anything else. 4 days' worth left, one lighter than it should have been if I'd only skipped a meal instead of a night. I forced my eyes back to the top and read it again. H. Fesk, steward of record, in my own cramped hand, sitting under the black scar where my name had been struck out. I have shut journals fast before, on pages I didn't want inside my head twice, and I'd promised myself on the 3rd landing I was done doing that with my own hand. Then I turned the leaf, because the ledger was thicker than 1 page's worth of grief, and the next leaf was the one I'd been carrying 6 days without an answer for it. It was still blank. It had been blank since a requisitions clerk bound it into my 6th-floor ledger by mistake, or by something that only wore the shape of a mistake, and I had told myself then that I would find out what it wanted from me when the time came. The header was printed clean along the top, same as every certification page in every guild ledger. Bellow Deep, floor 7. Below it, 2 boxes weighted side by side. Dormant. Active. A line for a surveyor's seal. A line for a signature. Nothing else. No doors drawn, no dimensions, because nobody had ever surveyed this room until an hour ago, and the page had known that, and waited anyway. Sitting on stone that had finished forming itself around a man's absence, I already knew what it had been waiting for. 7 floors, stamped dormant, paid 400 crowns apiece. 2,800 crowns was the number I had written to Teodri 6 nights ago, like an arithmetic problem instead of a prayer, and it was still sitting in the guild's ledgers somewhere, waiting on my seal the same way this page had waited on my hand. I could check the box. I could write dormant in the surveyor's line under it, the way I had written dormant over floor 2 with 9 names crawling up my arm, and a lie already forming on my tongue. And nobody topside would ever know the difference, because the only man who could contradict me had just been folded into this floor's walls, along with everything else it had decided to keep. 9 of them would stay exactly where they were, retained, repeating. No report, no names on any guild roll, no families told anything but unrecorded, the same word that had already cost me everything once.
Or I write what happened.
I said, out loud, to a room that had no one left in it to hear me say it, and the sound of my own voice in that stillness was steadier than I expected it to be. I dipped the pen. My hand went toward the dormant box first. I won't pretend it didn't. I thought about the exact wording of Teodri's indenture, the clause that named the amount and the years, the morning he'd signed it in an office I hadn't been allowed into because the guild had already ruled me unfit to speak for either of us. The nib touched the corner of the box and left a black dot no bigger than a period, and I sat there with the pen held so still above the page that the stillness itself felt like the effort, close enough that a stronger wind would have finished the stroke for me. It waits, Reyd Slate had said, in her own gouged hand, where nothing topside could reach it to amend it. I thought of the 4 minutes Dassel had spent bleeding out with those 2 words on a loop nobody had ever carried up the shaft. I thought of 8 more names under his, copied whole into my ledger by a hand that hadn't asked my permission the first time, and how, since, it had been the one true thing I'd done on this whole contract. And there was the number Fesk had died defending. 211 people who did not exist yet, waiting on the other side of that box to go on not existing. He had not been wrong about what active would cost, and I had never once told him he was. But 211 futures set against 9 men already dead and looping, against a debt that would own my brother until it finished him too, was not an argument I could win by keeping the box shut and calling the silence mercy. Somebody had to be honest about what this floor had done, or the only account of it would stay whatever the next steward's desk decided to write. I did not check the box. I wrote instead, Dassel, Coin, Hask, Vask, Soreth, Fen, Baird, Otway, Marsh. 9 names, 9 registries, in full, the way certification never requires, and I gave it anyway. I wrote that Captain Ilma Reyd's last order to her second seat was to go up the rope first at the collapse, and that her second seat had obeyed it, and had lived, and had let a guild hearing rule the whole descent out of existence, rather than testify to any of it. I wrote that the debt attached to my brother's name traced back to that single unspoken hour, and not to any failure of mine as a surveyor. I wrote Fesk's seal name 11 times, once for every year he had pressed a false dormant into this dungeon's stone from a desk he never once left. And under it I wrote what he'd told me himself, standing in this doorway, alive, before the floor finished closing around the end of his sentence. Then I pressed my stamp into the box marked active, and held it there longer than a certification stamp has ever needed holding, as if the ink might change its mind if I let go too soon. Somewhere below the new floor, stone shifted against stone, heavier now than the frightened, testing sound from before, as if it had been waiting a decade for a floor to have a status worth moving under. The shift traveled up through the soles of my boots before any sound of it reached me. Bellow Deep was live again, 7 floors deep, and nothing stood between me and it but a ledger. 2,800 crowns went out of the world with that stamp. So did the buyout. Teodri would wake up tomorrow still owned by a contract he'd signed for a sister the guild had erased, and nothing on this floor could undo that signature, any more than it could undo the 9 names crawling up my own arm. I thought of him bent over that clerk's desk, our mother's pen shaking a little in his hand, because mine wasn't there to steady it, and I let the number sit in my chest at its full weight, instead of rounding it down to something I could carry easier. The stamp was still warm in my palm when I capped the ink. I did not reach for the dormant box again. The guild dispatch case was still clipped to my belt, dented from the fall through the floor 3 gap, but sealed tight. I fit the ledger into it and closed the clasps one at a time, checking each by feel in the dark, same as I'd been taught before I ever had a mark to check them for me.
Leaving the room,
I said, and started back up through the passage Fesk's door had opened, past Reyd's unnumbered stair, up through floor 2 where 9 restarted men were somewhere in their loops again, toward the 3rd landing, and whatever length of guild chain still hung there from the last time something had come down it. The chain was where I'd left it, coiled slack against the sealed warrant box. I looped the case handle through its hook, cinched it, and gave 3 hard pulls. The old signal, the one every surveyor learns before their first descent, the one that means haul away, there's something down here worth taking up. The chain drew taut. It held there, humming faintly with whatever weight was testing it from above. I stood in my own lamplight, hands still stinging from the last time I'd tried to climb this line myself, with no way of knowing whether a winch built to read a missing token as an unclaimed body would tell the difference between a woman and a case. Chapter 17. Recovery. The chain took the strain and started to climb, and for 3 heartbeats I let myself believe in it. The good, clean pull of something going up. The pull I'd hauled 100 times myself. Other surveyors' finds rising toward the surface, back when I stood at a winch instead of hanging off the end of one. The case swung once against the shaft wall, a hollow knock, and rose out of my lamp's circle into the dark above the sealed landing. Then the hum in the chain changed pitch, a hitch, a stutter, like a hand catching on cloth. And then nothing. The line hung loose from wherever it had stopped, not taut, not moving, giving me 2 feet of slack when I pulled it that it had not given me before. I hauled anyway, hand over hand, until my palms found the same raw places they'd found the last time and reopened them. I called up once, into the dark above the sealed landing, the same words the boy at the drum used to answer on the way down, and got nothing back but my own voice returning flatter than I'd sent it. Fesk had emptied that station same as he'd emptied every other one behind me. Whether the boy had been paid off or simply moved on, the shaft didn't say. The chain came, and told me nothing. Somewhere above the 3rd landing, past a warrant box welded shut on a steward's authority, a mechanism built to read tokens instead of women had done exactly what I'd told myself it would do. Out loud, so I couldn't pretend later I hadn't known.
Assent warrant. 2 of 3. Recovery unauthorized.
I read it twice by lamplight, checking whether it said anything different the second time. It didn't. Then I let the chain drop. My hand did not go to it again. A weakness climbed into my legs that had nothing to do with the ropes, and I sat down on the stone rather than trust myself standing. I set the lamp down beside me before I dropped it, working the motion slow and exact, careful not to break it twice. No mark to log the drop for me now. No blue lines resolving out of the dark to tell me where the floor was solid and where it wasn't. Just the one small circle of light I'd carried since the winch platform, and the walls it could reach. There was nothing left to try. Floor 7 had closed its door on Fesk and would not open it again for me. Not that I'd have gone back through it. The stair down was the one I'd already taken. Above me, a warrant box with my name owed and not paid. I had a ledger with Fesk's confession in it, and 9 names in my own hand, and a blank page with my registry number on the shaft head plate, 11 years before I could have written it there, and none of that was rope. 1 day of rations left, maybe less, by my last honest count the night I stamped floor 7. 3 nights into whatever this room turned out to be. I did the sum once and put the pencil down without writing it in the ledger. It wasn't the kind of finding anyone downstream of me needed logged. So I did the only thing I still knew how to do without a mark to do it for me. I paced the room. 9 strides long, 6 wide, counted the old way, heel to toe, before the guild ever put a mark on my wrist and told me it would count for me from then on. I found the east wall load-bearing by the sound it gave back to my knuckles, dull and full, no hollow behind it. I found the door I'd come through, and the door I hadn't tried, set into the north wall and swollen shut at the base. No give in it, no draft coming under it that would tell me where it led. Empty of hazard, empty of the retained dead, no voice waiting to repeat itself at me out of the corners. Just stone, and my own breath, and the lamp throwing a circle that did not so much as flicker when I crossed it.
Room unnumbered,
I said, out loud, because a survey read aloud is a survey a room can't argue with.
9 by 6. 2 exits, 1 passable, no marked hazard, no occupant.
I wrote it that way in the ledger, the pencil scratching louder than it should have in a room this quiet. Somewhere in the writing of it my fingers went cold in a way the air didn't account for, a cold with no source in the room, the kind that comes right before a hand lets go of yours. The lamp's circle didn't shrink. It didn't need to. The room around the light had already stopped being a place I was passing through. It had started being a place I was going to stay. I kept writing anyway. That was the discipline. Dassel had died mid-sentence, and his sentence had outlived him 9 repeats over. If a record was what I was going to be, I intended it to be an accurate one, logged the way I'd been taught before anything with a steward's seal had ever amended a page of mine. Dimensions, materials, condition of the door, the date, which I had to think about, because I had lost track of it somewhere around the 3rd landing, and had to count backward from the day I'd stamped floor 7 to get it right. The last line I wrote was my name. I spelled out my full name this time, the whole of it, rather than the surveyor's shorthand, the cramped VO that the Deep's own pre-filing had already used for me on floor 4 before I'd earned it, matching it exactly to the brass plate at the shaft head, spelled there 11 years before I walked into this dungeon to find it. V. Aurum, Registry 4471, and beneath it, because it was true, and because I was the only surveyor left to certify it, the word retained. I won't be there when the case reaches the surface. I don't have to be, to know how it goes, because I sat through this exact procedure once already, 11 years ago, on the other side of a low table in a guild hearing room that smelled of lamp oil and cold tea. Teodri will be the one to break the seal. He's the only family a dead surveyor's estate has left to notify, and the guild doesn't send its own clerks to open a case that arrived with no warrant token attached. His hands will be steadier than mine were at the end. He'll read the first page and know, as I knew standing at that plate on day 1, that the woman who wrote it isn't coming home to explain it to him. There is no line in it that frees him. I made sure of that, certifying floor 7 active instead of dormant, and a live dungeon pays no bounty and buys out no indenture. I knew that before I stamped it, and I stamped it anyway. There is no line in it that names him anything at all. Just 9 names that aren't his, and a captain's last order, and a steward's confession, and mine. It will be read aloud at a hearing regardless. That's how the guild keeps its own record honest. When it bothers to, every recovered ledger goes into the transcript, word for word, whether or not it changes a single crown owed. Somebody will read my name into the minutes in a flat clerk's voice, the way nobody read it 11 years ago, correctly spelled, exactly once. It won't bring the chain back down. It won't need to.